Welcome back. Did you enjoy the subject of death? It might seem quite depressing, but the odd thing is that the Greeks were surprisingly philosophical about death, considering what a frequently violent world they lived in. And you can see that, of course, in both Greek myth and also Greek tragedy. So what we see in Chapter 9 is the way the Greeks handled the subject of death, considering that death was, in fact, completely unavoidable by everybody on Earth. What exactly did it mean to die, and what types of mythic stories and mythic worship should one undergo in order to observe death properly? So both Greeks and Romans did understand the permanence of death in the sense that death was essentially a threshold that cut one off from any further connection with the living world for almost everybody, with only a few notable exceptions, such as Theseus, Heracles, Dionysus, and a few others. Orpheus also was able to go down and come back up, but he failed to do so with his wife Eurydice as he had hoped. So death was seen as permanent. The Greek hero Achilles was in Homer's Iliad, is confronted with the rather taxing problem of whether he will live a life that is long and indistinguished, that is a rather dull life, or whether he will live a short, glorious life. Well, in Odyssey, when Odysseus in fact goes down to the underworld, one of the few who is able to go down and return, he meets Achilles down there, who tells him he seems to have regretted his decision, because he says, I would much rather be a poor slave somewhere and still alive than king over all the dead. So the Greek underworld is a pretty depressing place, and there is no real sense of redemption after death as one often thinks of, although later philosophy does actually explore this topic quite fully, especially in the dialogues of Plato. So it was discussed quite a bit, but I don't think there ever was a sense of death as being a wonderful, cheery place to end up by either Greeks or Romans. They were both fairly austere in their viewpoints of it. So death itself had quite a few customs associated with its observance. There was a formal procedure for how the body was laid out and carried through the center of a city, especially if it was a state funeral. And frequently the women in a family would be in charge of going through what's called in Greek the thranos, which is the public mourning procedure in which they would strike their heads and also their breasts as a sign of public mourning. We see that depicted in Greek art, especially on the geometric pottery, in which you see a bier that's in the middle of the body of the vase with a body on it, and then on each side you see little figures of people with their heads covered with their hands like this, and again, that's the women who are beating their heads as a symbol of mourning. So this was in fact a public procedure when someone passed away, and the polis would in fact consider itself diminished by the death of anybody. Death was of course a very critical problem with wartime, since so many people passed away. In 5th and 4th century BC Athens and other locations, it sometimes was the custom for a public official to deliver a eulogy over the dead, especially in warfare, and that's where we get the very famous oration in Thucydides' history of the war between Athens and Sparta, the oration that's given by the Athenian statesman Pericles over those who have fallen in the first year of the war between Athens and Sparta. So death is observed very closely by the Greek polis. Its mythic presentation essentially does present it as a barrier between the living world and the world beneath. And again, very few are able to cross that barrier. And when Orpheus tries to do so after his wife Eurydice is stung by a snake and goes down to the underworld, the only way that Orpheus is, after he sings and plays his lyre and charms the underworld deities, the only way that he's able to retrieve his wife is if he's able to bring her back to the above world without actually turning back to look at her. And unfortunately, right at the last moment, as he was getting back into the sunshine, he turns back, looks at her, and of course, in doing so, condemns her to eternal death thereafter. The underworld itself is depicted for us in a few places, including in the play Frogs by Aristophanes. The sense we have is that the underworld is separated from the above world by either a lake or a river. The lake is called Acheron, and the river is called Styx, although Acheron is sometimes also applied to the river as well. And the point here is that the river cannot be crossed except by the traveling on the ferry that's brought out by the ferryman named Charon. The ferryman had to be paid, so it was frequently the case that a body was laid in state with coins either on the eyes or sometimes placed in the mouth, so that the soul of the deceased person would be able to pay the ferryman to go across the river and be conveyed over as a soul now into the underworld. When the soul was to cross over, the soul was required to drink from another river called Lethe, L-E-T-H-E, which is the river of forgetfulness. And the whole point there was to eliminate any memory of the past life from the soul before it crosses over into the world itself. Once you get into the underworld itself, there are different depictions of how it's geographically laid out. There are some other rivers, Cocytus and Phlegethon, the river of fire that come about. In some versions, you have different sections of the underworld committed to different lives of the souls who occupy it. So you might have souls who are committed here for criminal behavior. In other places, souls who died very young as infants. In other places, famously in Virgil's Aeneid, souls who died of love. That's Queen Dido of Carthage, who died of love because Aeneas, the future Roman hero, abandoned her after having committed his time to her, and so on. So you have those. If you can keep on going down and into the underworld, you'll eventually come to Tartarus, which is the location of eternal damnation. There are several famous stories about who is stuck there, such as Ixion on the wheel, Sisyphus pushing the boulder up to the top of the mountain and then having it roll back down, Tantalus, who is at a dinner table but can't eat or drink anything because when he tries, it all runs away. Or in other versions, he's in a pool of water up to his chin, and if he tries to drink, the water runs off. There's fruit above him on a tree, but if he tries to grab it, the tree pulls its branches back, and so he's unable to eat or drink at any time. You also have the daughters of Danaus, who slew all their husbands, so they are left in the middle of the river, constantly trying to fill water jars that have holes in them. And so that's their punishment, that they're told that they have to fill the water jars, and they're constantly doing so, and of course will never successfully do so. So these are some of the eternal damnation procedures that occupy the realm called Tartarus, the region of eternal damnation for anybody whose crime is that severe. On the positive side, we have the Elysian Fields. They are not spoken too much of in the Greek mythology, but they become a much greater thing in the Roman mythology. One who does get committed in the Greek world to the Elysian Fields is the brother of Agamemnon named Menelaus, regarded as an all-good man. And in the Roman world, Aeneas goes down into the underworld to find his father Anchises, who's in the Elysian Fields. And Aeneas goes to talk to Anchises in order to learn about his own history and his reason for traveling to Italy, which is, of course, eventually to found the city of Rome. You'll see that later when we come to Virgil in a later chapter. So the underworld overall is a fairly depressing and unhappy place, but understanding about it does appear to have given both Greeks and Romans a certain sense of finiteness for their own life. Probably caused them to appreciate life more for themselves, knowing that in fact, they were mortal. And in fact, some of the limitations that we see with the Greek gods sometimes are that because they are not mortal, they cannot in fact understand how damaging certain occurrences can be for mortal life. And that's especially seen in the Trojan War in Homer's Iliad, when the gods actually go down into the field and they start fighting amongst each other, and they're actually having a great time smiling to each other while they're fighting, when in fact it's the mortals right beneath their feet who are fighting on the real, not at all humorously, and end up dying. So the Greek gods simply are not able to appreciate, because of their immortal condition, how precious life is for the mortals. And another Greek deity who is actually rather envious of her beloved because of his mortal status is Calypso, the nymph who ends up falling in love with Odysseus when he is washed ashore on her island on his way home to Ithaca. And she keeps him there for quite a long time, and she knows that she cannot get him to love her because he is committed to arriving home to see his wife Penelope again. So he will eventually pass away. She almost wishes she could, because she would rather do so rather than live without Odysseus at her side. So death has quite a few stories built into it, but it always does carry the sense of terminality for the humans. Now, there are some philosophical takes on death. You have in later Stoic philosophy these famous paradoxes that actually tie in with the theories of Lucretius, the Roman poet, whom I mentioned in a previous video. There is a paradox associated with Zeno about Achilles, the Greek hero, who is in a running race with a tortoise. That if the tortoise is given a head start, Achilles will be unable to catch up with the tortoise. So here's the tortoise trying to run this way very slowly, and here's Achilles trying to catch up. But the paradox is that because Achilles is always cutting in half the distance between him and the tortoise, he can never actually catch up to the tortoise, because you can never get rid of all the halves to finally get to zero. So the tortoise has to win, even though Achilles is the fastest runner on Earth. That was one paradox. Another famous paradox had to do with the arrow. So let's say that somebody shoots an arrow through the air, and let's say that in the modern world somebody is able to take a photo of it. So here goes the arrow, right there. So somebody with a cell phone is able to take a picture of that arrow. So now you have a photo of the arrow. The question is that arrow in motion or still? This was quite a problem for the ancient Greeks to figure out. Well, the paradox in both cases has been resolved in the modern world by the concept of the infinitesimal, which ironically is the very thing that Lucretius talked about, the indivisible atom, the element of matter that's a non-zero, indivisible concept. So that in fact there would come a point eventually, if you cut down the motion finely enough, that finally you would be able to see that the arrow actually was in fact in motion as opposed to still. And obviously eventually Achilles would be able to finally bring the distance between himself and the tortoise to zero and overtake the tortoise. So the infinitesimal is vital, and that's actually what Lucretius talks about, that matter consists of these indivisible atoms. So Lucretius, in the third of his 6 books on the nature of things, ties in his atomic theory back to death. Because Lucretius states, and this is in a contradiction with a lot of the other thinkers of the day, that death is nothing more than the release of the soul atoms from the shell of the body. So that all of the soul atoms, which are very fine, all escape the body atoms, which are much thicker and fleshier, eventually out into the grand cosmos to eventually recombine into some other random thing. So a person originally composed as a human being will have his atoms just totally dispersed. There'll be nothing left of him anywhere on those atoms, and eventually they'll all come back down, or probably combined with some other atoms somewhere along the way, and what was once a person is now, say, a frog. Not surprisingly, that idea did not carry a lot of favor with a lot of thinkers of the day who wanted to believe in some kind of afterlife that was better than current life. And so the theories of Lucretius and his predecessor Epicurus, the Athenian philosopher who gave Lucretius the idea, a lot of that concept did not, in fact, carry a lot of favor. However, One advantageous aspect of Lucretius's philosophy with the atoms is that because he could depict death in this way, as the simple release of atoms, he could depict death as a very simple eternal sleep, and therefore something not to fear. Lucretius was anxious to free his readers from the fear of religion, which he saw as something relegating or restricting somebody. That if one was afraid of what might happen to one might end up carrying out bad behavior that in fact one could have avoided with a proper rational mind. So Lucretius wants his readers eventually to be liberated from the fear of religion. He shows some examples, such as the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia as having been carried out because of fear of punishment from a deity. And in the case of Agamemnon, fear of the loss of face of not being able to carry out the mission to Troy successfully. So Lucretius says, no, not acceptable. Instead, if somebody recognizes that the death is just simply a simple termination of one's life at the point when the soul atoms are released out of the body, then one can finally alleviate oneself of the fear of death and not get caught up in incorrect forms of behavior that could cause a lot more trouble in one's life. Okay, so that is the scary concept of death. Now, death overhangs the lives of both heroes and heroines, and in our next chapters for tomorrow, we will look at chapters 10 and 11, in which we explore more closely the particular heroes and heroines in Greek mythology, and in part the way that death is intertwined closely with the adventurous lives of those heroes and heroines. Okay, we'll see you for tomorrow's videos.